We've been told for years that motivation is the spark, that it's the essential ingredient we need before we begin any meaningful work. People wait for it like it's a gift from the universe, something that must hit you before you can take action. But what neuroscience and personal experience clearly shows is something radically different, that motivation is not the cause of action, but its result. That's a shift in perspective that can redefine how we approach everything from our goals to our daily routines. On the day I decided to show up, I didn't feel particularly inspired. There was no dramatic music playing in the background. In fact, I was tired, I was unmotivated. The work felt pointless, repetitive, heavy. But something in me had shifted. I was no longer willing to be controlled by how I felt. I wasn't interested in waiting for that imaginary lightning bolt. I simply stood up, went to the place where I do my work, and began. That first movement, the physical act of showing up, was all it took to start a very different process in my brain. Within minutes, I was more alert, more focused. The friction I felt in my mind started to ease, and surprisingly, I found myself immersed in the task I had dreaded just minutes earlier. That's the truth most people miss. The brain doesn't kick into a motivated state because you sat still long enough and wished for it. Motivation emerges through the act of engagement. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with drive, reward, and sustained effort, doesn't release just when you fantasize about achievement. It's released when you pursue something that matters, especially when it's effortful. And when you push yourself into action, even small action, the brain starts to reward you. It starts to reinforce that behavior. It begins to learn, this matters, this is valuable, keep going. That chemical shift in your brain isn't passive, it's triggered by effort. What I began to realize is that most of us are living in reverse. We think the formula is motivation, then action, but the actual formula is action, then motivation, then momentum. And momentum doesn't just build, it compounds. That means the more you act, the easier it becomes to act again, but the more you hesitate, the more resistance you build in your brain. Every time you avoid showing up, you reinforce the neural circuitry of avoidance. You teach yourself to retreat, to delay, to wait, and your brain becomes better at what you repeatedly do, which is either action or avoidance. When I chose to show up, I wasn't ready. I didn't feel like it. But I realized that readiness was irrelevant. What mattered was whether or not I would act, regardless of my emotional state, and that's where everything shifted. Because the moment I acted even with low energy, even without clarity, my brain responded. It engaged, it paid attention, and in return it gave me something I hadn't expected: presence, flow, focus. I didn't start with those things. I earned them by stepping into the work before I felt prepared. This is one of the most misunderstood principles of behavior change. We overvalue internal feelings and undervalue external action. We wait for the mood to be right, but the mood is shaped by the movement. When your body moves, your brain follows. Even a simple physical shift like walking to your desk or putting on your shoes to go outside sends signals to your nervous system that you are initiating behavior. And those signals begin to change your internal chemistry. That's not just theory, that's biology. Your physiology and psychology are deeply connected, and action is the bridge between them. One of the most powerful things I began to learn was that every time I showed up without motivation, I was training my brain in a new way. I was training it to decouple action from emotion. I was teaching myself that doing the work is not optional and not conditional. It is a non-negotiable. That's when everything started to change, because I no longer needed to feel a certain way to take the first step. I just needed to start, and when I started, the emotion I needed caught up. The motivation that seemed so far away came rushing in, but only after I acted. It didn't come first. It came later. It always does. You said, Keynote 2, expend it into the 800 words, don't ending sentences. Don't add any headings, ChatGPT said. Every time we repeat an action, especially when it's difficult or requires focused effort, something begins to shift beneath the surface in our brain, in our identity, in our capacity to handle challenge. That shift isn't magical, it's biological. The term for this is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on experience and behavior. But it's not enough to understand that this rewiring can happen. What matters is how and when it happens, and more importantly, What causes it to take place in a way that leads to meaningful, lasting change? When I decided to show up, I wasn't just crossing an item off a to-do list. I was starting a process that, even if I didn't realize it at the time, was instructing my brain to build new patterns. The human brain responds to consistency, not intensity, when it comes to forming lasting habits. You don't need to do something extraordinary one time. You need to do something uncomfortable, useful, or meaningful many times. And each time you do, especially when it takes effort, the brain starts to tag that behavior as important. It marks it as a high-priority neural activity. That's how those new circuits start to strengthen. That's how you start replacing the old pathways of avoidance, distraction, or procrastination with newer, more resilient ones built around commitment, effort, and engagement. People think change requires a huge emotional breakthrough, but it actually requires the repetition of small decisions. Each day I chose to show up even when I didn't feel like it. I was reinforcing a signal in my brain. This is who I am now. This is what I do. And it wasn't just the action that mattered. It was the timing and the repetition of that action in the presence of resistance. When something is difficult and you do it anyway, the brain releases neurochemicals like norepinephrine and acetylcholine, which heighten focus and alertness. That makes the experience more memorable and more likely to be encoded into long-term behavioral patterns. In simple terms, every time I pushed through resistance, I was not only doing the task, I was teaching my brain to value persistence, to associate effort with progress, and to reduce its sensitivity to discomfort. Neuroplasticity is not automatic. It doesn't happen just because time passes. It happens when certain conditions are met: attention, repetition, and challenge. And by showing up every day, even when it felt inconvenient or frustrating or boring, I was hitting all three of those conditions. I was paying attention, I was repeating the behavior, I was pushing against mental or emotional friction. That's the formula, and when you do that, something deeper than habit formation starts to occur. Your sense of identity begins to align with the behavior you're practicing, not because you said affirmations in the mirror, but because your actions proved it to your brain over and over again. The interesting thing is how quickly the brain starts to adapt once you engage consistently. That first week of showing up, the internal resistance was loud. It argued, it screamed, but after enough repetitions, the argument started to weaken. The voice of resistance didn't disappear, but it lost authority. It was no longer a command, just background noise. That's when I knew the brain was changing. The default mode was shifting from avoidance to action, from hesitation to forward movement. It wasn't easy, but it became automatic. And that shift didn't happen because I believed in myself. It happened because I gave my brain no other choice but to adapt. The mistake most people make is assuming that success is built on feeling good or being inspired or having clarity from the beginning. But all of those things are outcomes of consistency, not prerequisites for it. The day I began showing up, I stopped negotiating with my brain. I stopped waiting for it to cooperate. I understood that resistance is part of the process and that my job was not to eliminate it, but to override it again and again until the act of showing up was more familiar than the habit of hiding. And this is what people don't often see from the outside. They see the results, the growth, the momentum, and they think it must have come from a burst of motivation or some deep clarity about purpose. But it came from something far less glamorous and far more sustainable: repetition under pressure. It came from choosing the same behavior over and over, even when it wasn't convenient, and that consistency was not just about building discipline. It was literally about reprogramming the brain's reward system, making it more responsive to effort and less addicted to comfort. Over time, that choice to show up, which once required force and mental effort, became integrated. It became a default response. The brain began to expect it, to prepare for it, and the more I acted in alignment with this new identity, the more natural it became. The decision-making process shortened. There were fewer debates in my head. The resistance still showed up, but I no longer mistook it for truth. I recognized it as noise, and I moved forward anyway. And with each repetition, I reinforced a deeper truth that the brain follows behavior, not the other way around, and that the simple act of showing up is one of the most powerful tools we have to change not just what we do, but who we become, you said. Keynote 3 expanded into the 800 words don't ending sentences, don't add any headings, ChatGPT said. Some days the hardest part isn't the task itself, it's the internal battle that happens before you even begin, that quiet resistance. That whisper in your head saying, not today, or you're too tired, or it won't matter anyway. It's subtle, but persistent. It creeps in the moment you consider doing something that requires effort, and it grows louder the more important the task feels. That resistance isn't weakness or laziness. It's part of being human. It's part of the brain's natural tendency to conserve energy and avoid uncertainty or discomfort. But here's what matters. Resistance is not a signal to stop, it's data. It's your nervous system's feedback. It tells you exactly where the edge of growth is located, and the moment you feel it, the moment it tightens in your chest or fogs your thoughts, that's the exact moment you have a choice to lean in or walk away. Most people interpret resistance as a stop sign. They treat it as if it's proof that something's wrong, that if they were really meant to do something great, it would feel easy or exciting or clear. But the truth is, resistance shows up precisely because the task is meaningful. The brain flags anything unfamiliar or demanding as a potential threat, not because it is dangerous, but because it demands energy, change, or risk. That internal resistance is the brain trying to keep you in a predictable state because predictability feels safe. But nothing new, nothing transformative happens in that predictable zone. When I started showing up every day, I realized that resistance didn't go away. It just became familiar. It became something I expected to face. And instead of fearing it or trying to avoid it, I began to treat it like a compass pointing me toward the work that mattered most on those days when I didn't feel like working, when I felt mentally foggy or emotionally distracted. I learned to pause and observe that resistance without obeying it. I could feel it rising, like a tightening in the body, a series of thoughts racing through my mind, but I stopped letting it decide my next move. That shift in relationship to resistance is what changed everything. I wasn't trying to silence it anymore. I was trying to understand it. I started asking better questions. What is this resistance trying to protect me from? Is this fatigue or fear? Is this discomfort or just uncertainty? And with time, I realized that most of what I labeled as burnout or lack of motivation was actually unprocessed fear of failure, of judgment, or of stepping into unknown territory. The key was not to eliminate resistance, but to train myself to act anyway. To teach my brain through action that discomfort was not dangerous, that fear was not a valid reason to stop, that hesitation wasn't a command. Every time I acted in spite of resistance, I was sending a signal to my nervous system that it was safe to proceed. And the brain, through its incredible adaptability, began to learn. It began to reduce the intensity of those warning signals. The more I showed up, the less intimidating the process became, not because the tasks got easier, but because my brain had rewired itself to trust that I could handle the discomfort and still move forward over time. Resistance became something I welcomed, not because I enjoyed it, but because I recognized its value. I saw it as the boundary between who I was and who I was becoming. If I stayed on the side of comfort, I'd stay the same, but if I crossed that line, even by a small step, I was growing. That internal tension, that emotional friction, was a kind of feedback loop. It showed me exactly where my edge was, where the real work lived, and every day I showed up and leaned into that edge, I was building more than just skills or habits. I was building courage, self-trust, and emotional resilience. The brain loves patterns. It thrives on routine, on predictability. And if you let resistance win, even once, it learns that quitting or delaying is an acceptable option. That's how habits of avoidance are formed, not through one big decision, but through repeated small surrenders. But the opposite is also true. Every time you override resistance, even in a small way, you are rewiring your brain to trust effort, to favor movement, to crave progress. You're literally changing your default response to challenge. And that, more than anything, is what builds lasting transformation. not waiting for motivation, but training your brain to move forward even when motivation is absent. There's a very specific moment, right before you begin, where resistance reaches its peak. It's the hardest few seconds. It's the mental equivalent of standing at the edge of a cold pool. You hesitate, you overthink, you rationalize why today isn't the day, but if you just take one step, if you begin before your brain can talk you out of it, that resistance breaks. Not completely, but enough for you to take the next step, and then the next. That initial movement creates a cascade. It activates a network of neurochemicals that increase alertness and focus, reduce stress response, and promote sustained effort. But none of that begins until you begin. So now, when I feel resistance, I don't retreat. I lean in. I acknowledge it, but I don't give it authority. I use it as a map. Because the truth is, if you're not feeling some form of resistance, you're probably not doing anything meaningful. Growth lives on the other side of that tension, and the more often you cross it, the less control it has over you. Eventually, it becomes background noise. It doesn't disappear, but it loses its power. And what replaces it is a quiet confidence, not the kind that comes from believing everything will go perfectly, but the kind that comes from knowing you will show up anyway, even when it's hard, even when it's messy, even when everything in you wants to wait for a better moment that never arrived. You said, Keynote 4, expend it into the 8. 100 words, don't ending sentences. Don't add any headings, ChatGPT said. There's a specific kind of strength that doesn't look impressive from the outside, but changes everything from the inside. It's not loud or dramatic. It's not something you post about or get recognition for. It's the quiet decision to keep going when no one's watching, when no one's asking, when nothing feels exciting or new. It's the discipline of returning to your process, your work, your intention, over and over again, not because it's easy, but because you've made a commitment to yourself that you're no longer willing to break. The day I chose to show up was not a dramatic break. Through it was subtle, almost forgettable, but it marked the beginning of something deeper. The decision to stop letting my emotions dictate my consistency. When most people talk about progress, they think in terms of external results. How much weight they lost, how many followers they gained, how much money they made. But what I started to realize, especially after choosing to show up on the hard days, was that the real progress happens in the invisible moments, the ones where no reward is guaranteed, where the outcome is uncertain, but you choose to act anyway. That's the moment discipline is formed. That's the moment self-respect is built. Every time I honored my own word and followed through, I was reinforcing a deeper sense of internal strength. I wasn't just doing the task. I was becoming someone who does hard things, someone who doesn't abandon themselves when things get uncomfortable. This is the part of growth that most people miss because it doesn't look impressive at first. It looks like waking up early when you'd rather sleep. It looks like doing another rep when your muscles are burning. It looks like writing a page when your mind is blank. It's repetitive, unglamorous, and often unrewarded. But it is precisely because it's hard that it creates change. The brain adapts through challenge. It reshapes itself not when things are easy, but when it is forced to confront difficulty with effort. When I kept showing up, especially when I didn't feel like it, I was not just maintaining a streak. I was training my nervous system to normalize discomfort, to stop overreacting to internal resistance, and to build resilience that went deeper than willpower. Willpower can get you through a few tough moments, but identity sustains the long haul. And that identity is not something you wake up with, it's something you build, piece by piece, through the actions you repeat. Every time I chose to move forward when it would have been easier to step back, I was casting a vote for a different kind of person I wanted to become, not the person who waits for perfect conditions, not the person who needs to feel good before taking action, but the person who understands that showing up is the price of admission to anything worthwhile. And that the act of showing up is the reward, because it teaches you how to trust yourself in the face of uncertainty. There's a certain power in knowing that you don't need ideal conditions to create progress, that you don't need motivation to start, that you don't need everything to be in place before you act. Once I understood that, I stopped waiting for the perfect mindset. I stopped chasing the illusion of readiness. Instead, I started building a foundation based on action, not feeling. I started designing my day around behavior, not inspiration, because the reality is your brain doesn't respond to what you intend to do, it responds to what you actually do. And the more you act in alignment with your goals, especially when it's inconvenient, the more your brain begins to wire that behavior as default. The people who succeed over time aren't the ones who feel amazing every day. They're the ones who have learned to act despite how they feel. They've trained their nervous system not to over-identify with momentary emotions. They've built routines that lower friction. They've built a mindset that expects obstacles, anticipates resistance, and chooses movement anyway. That's not about being superhuman, it's about being consistent, and that consistency, over time, becomes freedom. Because once you've proven to yourself that you can show up without needing to feel ready, you're no longer trapped by your moods. You're no longer hijacked by your excuses. You've built something stronger than a temporary push. You've built a system for sustained progress. There's this quiet shift that happens after weeks or months of this kind of repetition. At first, it's hard to notice. You still feel resistance. You still hear that voice trying to talk you out of it, but your response is different. You don't believe it as quickly. You don't give it the same power. The hesitation shows up, but you've created a pause between the thought and the reaction, and in that space you make a different choice. That's the moment the habit becomes part of you. That's when the identity shift starts to crystallize. You're no longer someone trying to be disciplined. You're someone who acts with discipline by default. This kind of transformation isn't flashy. It won't always make sense to people around you, but it will anchor you in the moments when everything feels uncertain. It will carry you through the days when the external rewards haven't shown up yet. It will keep you rooted in your purpose when distraction and doubt start pulling you off course. That's the power of showing up not once, but repeatedly, especially when it's hard. Because every single time you return to the work, the process, the practice, you are reminding yourself who you are and what you're capable of becoming, not through what you say or hope for, but through what you consistently choose to do even when it would be easier not to.